Okay, this is Bracelet on friendshipbracelet.net, number 97,067 and 6. And it's composed of all the types of knots. So we're going to start with making a brown knot, and to do that you're going to start at the end. Oh, and you're going to want to pair them up first, so these two together, 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 and these two together. So what you're going to want to do for your first knot is you're going to take the brown one and you're going to make a backwards knot onto the blue. Set those aside. Take your next two. You're going to make a forward knot onto the blue so that a brown knot shows up. You're going to want to set those aside because you're done with them. You're going to take your red and your brown. You're going to make a backward knot with your brown knot showing, brown knot over the red knot. And you're going to set those two aside. You're going to pick up your brown and your red one. You're going to make a forward knot onto your red. Set those aside. Move on to your next two. You're going to make a backwards knot onto your blue knot so that a brown knot shows up. Set those aside. And take your last two and make a forward knot onto your blue knot so brown knot shows up. Basically, you're going to want brown knots all the way across your first row because that's it. And it goes backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, forwards. Then you're going to want to leave out the two brown ones and you're going to want to repair them. So blue with blue, brown and brown, red and red, and brown, brown. Okay, start with your first two. You're going to want to make a forward knot so that the blue goes onto the brown. Set those aside. Move on to your next two. And you're going to want to make a forward so the brown knot shows up. Then you're going to want to move on to your making a red knot, which is also a forward knot. Red onto red. Set those two aside. Move on to brown. Make a forward knot. Brown knot shows up, brown onto brown. Set those two aside and then move on to your blue knot. You're just going to want to make a backwards knot. So for this row it's all forwards except for the last one, which is a backwards. Okay. Now you're going to want to bring the alternating ones back into the circle. You're going to want to repair everything. So you're going to pair your brown with your blue, blue with your brown, brown with red, red with brown, brown with blue, and blue with brown. Okay? Start with the first one. This is the third row, by the way. You're going to want to make a forward knot with brown on top of blue. Set those aside. Then you're going to make a backwards knot so that brown is on top of blue. The brown is the color that shows up. Set those aside. Then you're going to take your red and your brown, and you're going to want to make a forward knot so that brown shows up. And then this is the only knot in this circle where brown will not be the color to show up. This red and brown, because you're going to want to make another forward knot, red on top of brown, so that red shows up. Then you're going to take your brown and your blue, make a forward knot so that brown shows up. And then you're going to take your blue and your brown, you're going to make a backwards knot so that brown shows up. There you go, that's finished the third row. You've got your first 2 polka dots. Also, this is the setup that I did. There were 6 brown for what I chose. There were 4 blue, 2 red, and then that was how the first setup is. Okay, now you're on to your 4th row. On the 4th row, we're leaving out the blues on the end. They're not going to be involved in this. So you start off with 2 browns. You're going to make a forward knot so the brown shows up. Move those aside. Then you're going to have a blue and your red. And you're going to want to make a backwards knot so that red shows up. Set those to a side and move on. Now you have your 2 browns. You're going to want to make a forward knot so that brown shows up. Brown on top of brown. Set those to a side. Move on to your red and blue. And you're going to want to make a forward knot so that red shows up over the blue. So blue is not the one that shows up. Set those aside, move on to brown and brown, and you're going to want to make a forward knot. Okay, you're going to bring the 2 blues in from the sides because they're included again. And we are on to our 5th row. So we are going to pair everything up because none are being left out this time. Blue and brown, red and brown, brown and blue, blue and brown, red and brown, no, red and brown and blue. No, and blue and brown. Okay. Then you're going to want to make a backwards knot so brown shows up. Set those to a side. Take your brown and red. You're going to make a backwards knot so that red shows up. Move on to blue and brown. You're going to make a backwards knot so that brown shows up. Then you're going to move on to your brown and blue, make a forwards knot so that brown shows up. And then you're going to take your red and brown and make a backwards knot so that brown shows up. Then you're going to take your brown and blue, at the very end, you're going to make a forwards knot so that brown shows up. There we go. That is the fourth one. Now we are on to line 6. And on line 6, we are leaving out the browns on the ends, so those are not going to be included. We're leaving them out. Just set them to the side. You're going to pair everything up again. So you will have blue and red, brown and brown, blue and blue, brown and brown, red and blue. There we go. So you're going to start off with your blue and your red, and you're going to make a backwards forwards so that a red knot is what shows up, but it ends up in the same place where it started, blue and then red. And then you're going to set this to a side. And then you're going to make a forward knot with your brown on brown so that brown will show up. Just a simple forward knot. And you're going to have your 2 blues. You're going to make a forward knot so that blue shows up. Ugh. Then you're going to have your brown and brown. You're going to make a forward knot so that brown shows up. And then you're going to have your red and blue. You're going to do a forward backwards. So you start off making a forward, and then you make a backwards so the red shows up, but in the end you still end up with your 2 strings in the same place that they started, red and then blue. There we go. And then we are done with the 6th row, and we're on to the 7th. And for the 7th row, you're going to bring back in the browns from both sides and pair everything up again. So you can have brown and blue, red and brown, red and brown, brown and blue, blue and brown, brown and red, and blue and brown. It's basically just the same colors alternating. Okay, so you're going to start off, you're going to pick up your brown and your blue, and you're going to make a forward knot so that brown shows up. And then set those 2 to the side. Take your red and your brown, and you're going to want to make a backwards knot over the red with the brown so that a brown knot is what shows up. Then you're going to set them to the side. Then you're going to take your brown and your blue, and you're going to want to make a forward knot. And then you're going to set them to the side, and you're going to take your blue and your brown, and you're going to make a backwards knot so that brown shows up over the blue. Then you're going to take your brown and your red, and you're going to make a backwards knot so that red shows up over the brown. Then you're going to take your blue and your brown. You're going to make a backwards knot with your brown over the blue so the brown knot is what is shown. Grr. Oh no. There we go. You're going to make a, I'm just going to go back to that because I still have to make the backwards knot with the brown over the blue. There you go. Set those to the side. and we are on to the 8th row. In total, there are 20 rows. So for the 8th row, you're going to leave out the blues on either end, and then you're just going to have to repair everything. So on the ends, you're going to have brown and brown. Oh, wait. Yes. Blue and red, brown and brown, red and blue, and brown. So for the 8th row, you're leaving out the blue, and you're going to start off with brown on brown knot, forward knot, so that brown shows up. Set them aside. Then you take your red and your blue, and you're going to want to make a forward knot so that the red shows up. Then you're going to take your 2 browns. You're going to make a forward knot so that brown shows up. And then you're going to take the blue and your red, and you're going to make a backwards knot so that the red shows up. And then you're going to take your brown and your brown, and you're just going to make a forwards knot. And we are done with the 8th row. And we're on to the 9th. And we're going to bring the blues back in and repair everything. And so for the 9th one, your first knot is going to be a backwards knot with the brown knot showing up over the blue. You're going to set them aside. Take your brown and blue, and you're going to make a forward knot so the brown shows up over the blue. We're going to have another brown knot. You're going to set them aside. Take your red and your brown knots, your red and your brown string, make a forward knot so that red shows up over the brown. Move those to the side. Take your brown and red strings, and you're going to make a forward knot. Wait, don't make a forward knot yet. Yes, make a forward knot so that brown shows up over the red. Set those aside. Take your blue and your brown. You're going to make a backwards knot so the brown shows up over the blue. Set those aside. Take your brown and blue, and you're going to make a forward knot so the brown shows up over the blue. And then you are done with the 9th row, and you're on to the 10th. In fact, what I like to do when I get to this point is tape down the part that I have braided together so far. I guess braided would be the right word. Some people say weaving, but this isn't really weaving. Then you're going to move on to your 10th row, and you're going to leave out the 2 browns on either ends, and you're going to repair everything. So you're going to have your blue and your blue on the ends, your brown and your brown, your red and your red, your brown and your brown, and your 2 blues. Everything's got its color now. Because I think we're moving on to the second part of the pattern where it starts to become really blue. Okay, so the first one is a forward knot, blue on blue, so a blue knot will show up. It's a forward knot, but it could be backwards anyway because blue would still show up. Move on to your 2 browns, make a forward knot. So so that brown shows up. Move on to your 2 reds. You're going to make a forward knot, red on red, a red one will show up. Then you're going to have your 2 browns. You're going to make a forward knot so that brown shows up anyway. It would. And you're going to have your blue and your blue. And you're going to make a backwards knot. And blue will show up. There we go. Now we are done with the 11th. No, we are done with the 10th row, and we are on to the 11th row, and we will bring back in the browns and repair everything. Your first knot will be a forward knot, brown on blue, so that the brown will show up. Move them aside. Take your blue and your brown, and you're going to make a backwards knot so that the brown will show up over the blue. Move those aside. Take your brown and red and make a forward knot so that brown shows up over the red. Take your red and your brown knot. You're going to make a backwards knot so that brown shows up over the red. Then you take your brown and your blue. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, you have brown and blue. So you're going to make a forward knot so that brown shows up. And then you have light blue and brown. And you're just going to make a backwards knot so that brown shows up. Now that you're done with the 11th row and you're on to the 12th row, you're going to leave out the blues on the ends. And you're going to pair up your strings again. Brown, brown, red, blue, brown, brown, blue, red, and brown and brown. Your first knot's going to be a forward knot so that brown shows up. And then you're going to have a blue and a red, and you're going to make a forward knot so that blue shows up over the red. And you're going to have a brown and a brown. And you're going to make a forward knot so that brown will show up. You're going to have your red and blue. You're going to make a backwards knot so that blue shows up over the red. Set those aside, and you're going to have your 2 browns, and you're going to make a forward knot, and brown will show up. Dear, I hope brown shows up for most of you. If brown doesn't show up, that's going to be an issue. Okay, we have finished the 12th row, and we are on to the 13th row, and we will bring back in the blue strings at the end and repair everything. So we'll have blue and brown and red and brown and blue, blue and brown and red and blue and brown. Okay, first one is going to be a backwards a backwards knot so that brown shows up. Set those ones aside. You're going to take your brown string and your red string, and you're going to make a forward knot so that brown shows up. Set those aside. You're going to have blue and brown. You're going to make a forward knot so that blue shows up. Set those to the side. Then you're going to have your brown and blue. You're going to make a backwards knot so that blue shows up. Then you're going to have your red and brown. And you're going to make a backwards knot so that brown shows up. And then you're going to have your brown and blue, and you're going to make a forwards knot so that brown will show up on the ends. And that is the end of the 13th row. So now we're on to the 14th row. And for the 14th row, we're going to get rid of the browns on the end. Just set them aside. You're not going to be using them. You're going to repair everything. Red, blue, brown, brown, blue, 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 brown, brown, and blue, brown. Okay, you're going to start with your first knot, blue and red. You're going to make a forward knot so that blue shows up. Set those aside. You're going to make a forward knot with brown on brown. Set those to a side. You're going to make a forward knot, blue on blue. Blue will show up. And then you're going to have with your two browns a forward knot so that brown will show up. Then you're going to take your red and blue. And you're going to make a backwards knot so that blue will show up. Perfect. Now you're done with the 14th row and you're on to the 15th row. We're going to bring back in the brown ones on the ends, and we are going to pair everything back up again. So red, brown, brown, blue, blue, brown, brown, blue, blue, brown, and brown and red. Okay, so your first knot in the 13th row will be a forward knot, brown on red, so that brown will show up. Set those aside. Then you'll take your blue and your brown, you'll make a forward knot so that blue will show up. Set those aside. Then you will have your brown and your blue, and you will make a forward knot so that brown will show up. Set those aside. And then you will have your blue on brown. You make a backwards knot so that brown will show up. And you'll have brown and blue. And you're going to want to make a backwards knot so that blue will show up. And then you're going to have your red and brown for your last knot in this row. And you're going to want to make a backwards knot so that brown will show up. Brown on red. Okay. Done with the 15th row, on to the 16th row. And we leave out the reds on the end. We leave them out. Bye-bye. Okay. Then we pair them up again. Brown on brown, brown and brown, blue and blue, brown and brown, blue and blue, brown and brown. Pretty simple for this one. And you're going to want to make a forward knot so the brown shows up. You're going to take your two blues. You're going to make a forward backwards so that the string, both blue strings end up where they began, making half of forward, half of backward. And then you're going to make a forward knot with your 2 browns. And then with your blue and blue, you're going to want to make a backwards forward, half of a backwards, then finish with the forwards. And then you're going to have brown and brown, and you're going to make simply a forward knot. And there we are done with our, our 16th row, and we're on to our 17th row. And we're going to bring back in the reds. I'm going to pair everything up again. Brown and red, blue and brown, brown and blue, blue and brown, brown and blue, and red and brown. The first knot you're going to make is a backwards knot, so that brown shows up on top of the red. And then you're going to have your brown and blue, and you're going to make a backwards knot so that blue shows up on top of the brown. And then you're going to have your blue and your brown knots, and you're going to make a backwards knot so that brown shows up on top of the blue. And then you're going to have your brown and blue knots. No, not even knots. Your brown and your blue strings. And you're going to make a forward knot so that brown shows up. Set those aside. Take your blue and brown string. You're going to make a forward knot so that blue shows up. And then with your brown and red, you're going to make a forwards knot so that brown shows up on top of the red. And then you have finished your 17th row, and you will be starting your 18th. For the 18th row, you need to remove the brown string, put that off to the side, and then you'll have to pair everything up again. So it'll be blue, red, brown, 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 blue, blue. Oof, they get tangled at the bottom, so sometimes you're going to have to pull the string apart. Brown, brown, red, blue. Wait a minute. Oh yes, you're leaving out the brown string. And then you're going to have red, blue. So you're going to want to, for your first knot, do a backwards knot of blue on red, which will give you a blue knot with blue showing up. And then you're going to want to, for your second knot, make a backwards knot of brown over brown so that brown will show up. Then you're going to have your 2 blues, and you're going to want to make a forward knot so that blue shows up. And then you're going to have your 2 browns, and you're going to make a forward knot so that brown shows up. Set those aside, and you're going to have your brown and red. And you're going to make a forward knot so that blue shows up for your last knot on the 18th row. After finishing the 18th row, we will move on to the 19th row. And for the 19th row, you're going to want to bring back in your browns on either end. So you will pair them back up again, and you'll have blue, brown, brown, red, blue, brown, brown, blue, red, brown, and blue and brown. This is the 19th row, the second from the last, This is a repetitive pattern, by the way. So your first knot will be brown on blue, a forward knot. Then you will have, with your red and brown, you'll make a backwards knot so that brown will show up. Then you'll have your brown and blue strings. And you'll make a backwards knot. So blue will show up. And then you'll have your blue and brown. You'll make a forward knot so that blue will show up. And then you have brown and red. And you will make a forward knot so that brown shows up. And then you will take your blue and brown strings and you're going to make a backwards knot so that brown shows up. And now we are on to the last row. This is row 20. And we're leaving out the blue strings this time. And we will pair it up. Brown and brown. Blue and red, brown and brown, red and blue, and brown and brown. Your first knot will be a forward knot, brown on top of brown, set those aside, and then you will have red and blue, and you'll make a backwards knot so that blue will show up over the red, blue knot. And then you'll have your brown and brown, and you'll make a forward knot. A brown knot should show up. And you'll have your blue and red, and you'll make a forward knot so that blue shows up. And then you will have your two browns, and you will make a forward knot. And you can bring your blues back in. And if you want to just watch the video over, you can, so that you can see and just keep going over and over again. And this is what it will look like towards the end. It will look like that, repeating over and over again. And I printed up the pattern. And I colored in the ones that I was going to do. And yeah, basically that's it. This is pattern number on friendshipbracelet.net. This is pattern number 97,676, and I will put it in the description. Thanks for watching.